Hi, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. This podcast of the People's Pharmacy is brought to you by Squatty Potty Toilet Stools. They create healthy toilet posture for fast, easy elimination. Learn more about toilet posture and health at squattypotty.com. That's SQUATTYPOTTY.com.
Celiac disease has been called a clinical chameleon. That's because it can be so difficult to distinguish from many other conditions. This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
An intolerance to gluten found in wheat, barley, and rye can trigger symptoms that range from anemia and fatigue to digestive distress and migraine headaches. It often goes misdiagnosed for decades. Left untreated, celiac disease can lead to osteoporosis or nerve damage.
Dr. Alessio Fasano is one of the world's foremost authorities on celiac disease. He'll tell us about the latest strategies for diagnosing this condition and describe a mysterious condition called non-celiac gluten sensitivity.
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, should you go gluten-free?
First, this news.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, Australian researchers report no lasting benefits from acupuncture for chronic knee pain. The study included 282 middle-aged volunteers with osteoarthritis. They were randomized into 4 groups. One received no treatment, while another group got acupuncture with needles. The third group was treated with low-intensity lasers on the acupuncture points, while the fourth group was also treated with the laser devices, but the lasers were not activated. This was the sham acupuncture treatment. After 3 months, participants who received both needle and laser acupuncture had reduced pain compared to those who had received no treatment. There was no significant difference between the real acupuncture and the sham acupuncture groups. 9 months after the treatment stopped, there were no differences between any of the groups. The researchers interpret this as demonstrating no benefit from acupuncture, though there are few treatments that produce long-lasting relief once they're discontinued.
There's a disturbing new development in the epidemic of enterovirus D68 sweeping the nation. Children are the primary victims, and until recently, breathing problems were the only apparent serious complication. Now, physicians are concerned about cases of muscle weakness and paralysis that have developed in some infected children. Other symptoms include difficulty swallowing or walking, limb weakness, or weakness in the neck or trunk. These cases appear similar to the neurological damage caused by polio, but the children have not been infected with the polio virus. Over the last couple of years, there have been isolated cases of paralysis in children following respiratory tract infections. Some researchers now suspect that EVD68 may be the common denominator. Enterovirus is related to the polio virus, but there is no vaccine to prevent enterovirus infection.
A new study has identified important weaknesses in the FDA's approval of medical devices. The agency can speed devices such as implants, stents, or artificial joints through the approval process more quickly if they are considered substantially equivalent to equipment already on the market. The law requires that information about the new device be publicly available, but the new study examining 50 recently approved devices found adequate public information on only 16% of them. Until safety and effectiveness data about stents, implants, and other devices is made available, patients and health professionals are handicapped in their decision-making.
Although epidemiological studies show that people who eat fish are less prone to death from heart disease, trials of fish oil have been less promising. The latest, a Canadian study, was a randomized controlled trial of 337 people with atrial fibrillation. This common heart rhythm abnormality can lead to a heart rate as fast as 150 beats a minute. Volunteers in the trial took either 4 grams of fish oil or placebo daily for as long as 16 months. Sadly, those taking fish oil did not have fewer bouts of atrial fibrillation than those on placebo, nor did they have evidence of lower levels of inflammation. The lead author suggested that a Mediterranean diet might be preferable to fish oil supplements, although it would presumably not be a substitute for appropriate medical treatment of this serious condition.
Despite concern about conflicts of interest, hospitals and physicians are still getting substantial funds from pharmaceutical companies and medical device manufacturers. Federal law now requires disclosure of consulting and speaking fees, grants, entertainment, travel, and meals for healthcare providers. These payments amounted to $3.5 billion in the last 5 months of 2013, according to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. That amounts to $23 million a day.
Celiac disease is an intolerance to the protein gluten found in wheat, barley, and rye. Although there's a genetic predisposition to this autoimmune condition, a striking increase in incidence over the past several decades indicates there may also be a strong environmental factor. Some pediatricians have recommended exposing at-risk babies to gluten during their first year to protect them from developing celiac disease. But 2 studies published in the New England Journal of Medicine this week show that neither breastfeeding duration nor the timing of gluten introduction changes the likelihood of developing celiac disease. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. Celiac disease used to be considered a rare condition that only affected the digestive tract. Now doctors recognize it's far more common, affecting 1 person in every 100.
This week, the New England Journal of Medicine published 4 articles about celiac disease. An editorial noted that the incidence of celiac disease has quadrupled over the last 5 decades. What has changed in our environment?
For a better understanding of celiac disease and non-celiac gluten sensitivity, we turn to one of the world's leading experts, Dr. Alessio Fasano. He's director of the Center for Celiac Research and division chief of the Department of Pediatric Gastroenterology and Nutrition at Massachusetts General Hospital for Children. He's also a visiting professor at Harvard Medical School. He's author of Gluten Freedom, a research-based book that separates fact from fiction about how gluten affects health.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Fasano.
Thank you, Terry, for having me.
Dr. Fasano, when we first interviewed you many years ago, celiac disease was considered quite rare in the U.S. You point out in your book that in 1994, the National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Disease seemed unaware that celiac disease even existed here in the U.S. What's happened over the last 20 years?
A revolution, totally a revolution, because we went from a totally neglected issue because nobody was talking about celiac disease. Even professionals like colleagues didn't know how to spell celiac, to one of the most fashionable disease and intervention, the gluten-free diet that you can imagine, because it's the most popular. So it's been really a total shift of paradigm in the past decade.
Why was the U.S. so slow to catch up with other countries in recognizing celiac disease as a real problem that affected more than just a tiny handful of people?
Well, because the definition and the prototype clinical situation, celiac disease, that we had in mind at that time was totally deceptive. For us, celiac disease at that time was a pediatric condition with kids that have GI symptoms, with big belly and diarrhea, weight loss, and other issues. You have to be mainly of North European ancestor to be a risk for celiac disease. And if you look at that prototype, the statement, celiac disease does not exist in the United States, was extremely on mark, was correct. Then we learned that this was definitely not what celiac disease is all about. There is no age, no sex, no height, no color of the skin that is spared, provided that there are 2 conditions. 1, they are genetically predisposed. 2, that you eat gluten-containing grains. And therefore now we realize, based on these premises, that celiac disease is a global village that involves worldwide people, including here in the United States.
In the bad old days, dialing back about 20 or 30 years, here in the U.S., doctors were told this is called celiac sprue, spelled S-P-R-U-E, and quite often a child might be diagnosed, but then, and given a special diet, a very bland diet, often involving, as I recall, bananas, for example, and then they were told that they would grow out of it. Do people ever grow out of it? And what the heck was celiac sprue anyway?
Yeah, there were several synonyms that were used. The term celiac sprue comes from the fact that it was a form of involvement of the guts that comes from the Latin and Greek, etymology, and was the counterpart of the tropical sprue. There was the diarrhea due to infections that typically involved people that live in the tropics. So this was the counterpart, so to speak. And indeed, before that, a Dutch pediatrician discovered that gluten was the culprit. The only way to treat these kids was to feed them bananas. And, the idea was you eat bananas for a while and, the symptoms will go away and gradually reintroduce all the food stuff, including gluten that at that time nobody knew that was the culprit. And some kids would make it, some kids would not make it. As a matter of fact, the mortality was, 30% at that time. And the one that will make it fueled the sense that you can grow out of it, but you cannot. Because now, 2014, we know that this is an autoimmune disease. It's like to have diabetes, MS, rheumatoid arthritis, and therefore, by definition, you don't grow out of it.
Now, I find it interesting that Joe spelled sprue, but he didn't spell celiac, which also gives people a lot of trouble. It's C-E-L-I-A-C. You just said, Dr. Fasano, that celiac disease is an autoimmune disease. What are the consequences?
Yeah, not only is it an autoimmune disease, it's a one of a kind because, like any autoimmune disease, it's a recipe with two ingredients, genes, many that you have to be predisposed, and environmental trigger that is mismanaged because of, this genetic makeup that make your immune system to work in a kind of weird way. Rather than get rid of this enemy, the immune system starts to attack your own body. If you are not treated, the consequences are that you destroy the target organ, and celiac disease is the intestine. And this leads to symptoms that are, mainly gastrointestinal. And that was, the premises when we thought that this was a gastrointestinal disorder. However, over time, we learned that sometimes you can develop symptoms that have nothing to do with the intestine. So you can have anemia, chronic fatigue, you can have joint pain or arthritis, you can have infertility, you can have, neurological symptoms, you can have psychological symptoms like, short memory loss and mood swings, and I can go on and on and on. So this is truly a clinical chameleon if you don't take the culprit, i.e. gluten, out of your diet. And the reason why, even if the battlefield of the intestine and therefore the fight starts there, may eventually involve many tissue and organ, and matter of fact, this now is called a systemic disease, is because the gut is not like Las Vegas. What happened in the gut does not stay in the gut. These immune cells, were armed, may leave the intestine and go to other district and create inflammation somewhere else.
Well, this sounds suspiciously like something called leaky gut. And for a while, I think people resisted the idea. I heard, chiropractors talk about leaky gut, but gastroenterologists kind of resisted this notion. Well, you're a gastroenterologist. It sounds like this is something you're concerned about.
Yeah, but I hate the term leaky gut, honestly, because it's been vilified, indeed, not by all, but, the most extreme, alternative/complementary medicine folks, because it seems that everything that goes wrong in life is due to leaky gut. And therefore, the establishment, i.e., the scientific clinical establishment, has been very skeptical about this concept. However, we and many others after that, we started this, studies to look into what is the role of a gut that loses one of the key functions, i.e. a barrier to keep the enemy out of bay, outside of our body, will have as a consequence, we learned with our major surprise, and again, through studying celiac disease, that the recipe for autoimmunity called for a third ingredient. You got to be genetically predisposed. You have to be exposed to a trigger from the environment, but you also have to have an intestine that lost the barrier function so that these enemies can uncontrollably come in, because there is no checkpoint anymore, and therefore they can be seen by the immune system that eventually will lead to this autoimmune attack if you're genetically predisposed.
So what is the sanitized, physician-approved name for leaky gut these days?
Increased gut permeability.
Aha. So permeability is a more acceptable term. And I guess what this means is that when there is permeability, that is to say these amino acids and proteins and other components of what we eat get past that barrier and into the bloodstream, they begin to trigger this autoimmune reaction you're talking about. One symptom you didn't mention affects the skin. We've heard of it called dermatitis herpetiformis, and it can produce unbearable itching, often misdiagnosed. Can you just give us a word about it, please?
Sure. And again, this concept of increased permeability really resolved what was a conundrum in the scientific community. How big molecules like proteins that instigate the immune response leading to autoimmunity comes in our body. Because under normal circumstances, when the intestine works well, it's like pretending that somebody will come into a room with the door closed. If you don't open the door, you can't come in. We always brushed out that it was not a big deal. And then finally, with this appreciation that increased permeability can be part of it, we have a better understanding. I was telling you before that, again, once this enemy, they come in, this immune system its soldiers, i.e. immune cells, start to be armed. They produce chemicals that will create collateral damage that is called inflammation. Sometimes, for reasons we totally don't know right now, these cells are programmed to leave the intestine and go somewhere else. And you're absolutely right. Among the other districts of the skin, where they cause inflammation, leading to extremely itchy, blustery lesion that's called dermatitis herpetiformis. When this was described the first time, actually was not described as a skin condition, rather a psychiatric condition, because the people killed themselves rather than to deal with this. And there was no solution until, somebody linked the DH to gluten, and therefore part of the autoimmune response that characterized celiac disease, because the only solution for this very disturbing skin condition is to go gluten-free.
Dr. Fasano, the incidence of celiac disease has been revised largely in response to the research that you and your colleagues have led. How common is celiac disease?
Very. 1% of the general population worldwide seems to be affected by celiac disease. So this is one of the most frequent genetically based disorder of humankind. And it's on the rise. We're in the midst of an epidemic like for any other immune disease.
You're listening to Dr. Alessio Fasano, founder and director of the Center for Celiac Research and division chief of the Department of Pediatric Gastroenterology and Nutrition at Massachusetts General Hospital for Children. He's also a visiting professor at Harvard Medical School. His book is Gluten Freedom.
We need to take a short break. When we come back, we'll find out what exactly is gluten.
What are the differences between gluten sensitivity and celiac disease? How are they diagnosed?
We'll also learn why Dr. Fasano sees this as a global epidemic.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
If you like the information you hear when you listen to The People's Pharmacy, you may also enjoy our book published by National Geographic. It's The People's Pharmacy Quick and Handy Home Remedies, available online at peoplespharmacy.com or at your favorite bookstore. Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by Squatty Potty Toilet Step Stools, creating healthy toilet posture for fast, easier elimination. More information about how toilet posture affects your health at squattypotty.com.
And by Red X Industries, makers of utterly smooth creams and lotions that deeply moisturize to make dry skin feel soft and smooth. The number's 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
If you'd like to order a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. This is show number 964. That number again, 800-732-2334. Or find it online at peoplespharmacy.com.
Today on the People's Pharmacy, our topic is celiac disease, an autoimmune condition triggered by exposure to a protein in gluten. Our guest is one of the world's leading experts. Dr. Alessio Fasano is director of the Center for Celiac Research and division chief of the Department of Pediatric Gastroenterology and Nutrition at Massachusetts General Hospital for Children. He's also a visiting professor at Harvard Medical School. He's written Gluten Freedom, a book that separates fact from fiction about how gluten affects health.
Dr. Fasano, we have an email from Cindy in Martinsburg, West Virginia. She says, what is the latest research on gluten sensitivity and celiac disease? I think she came to the right place. Eliminating gluten has turned my life around in a positive way. I do not have celiac disease, but I am very sensitive to gluten. Can you tell us, please, about gluten and about the difference between celiac disease and gluten sensitivity?
Sure. Till the recent past, the paradigm was that if you have a problem with gluten, it got to be celiac disease, because we thought that the only disturbance that you can have with gluten was this autoimmune process that attack your intestine. And there are tests. There are very good tests to make sure that indeed this is what is the problem that you have. If you test negative for the screening of celiac disease in the past, we will advise the patients that the gluten-free diet will not be appropriate to solve his or her symptoms because the problem is being ruled out. Over the years, particularly in the past 4 or 5 years, we learned, thanks to the increased awareness about celiac disease, the gluten-free diet, that many people, they suffer very similar symptoms that can be ameliorated if they go gluten-free, even if they don't have celiac disease. Nevertheless, to say that as we face skepticism when we said that celiac disease was frequent in the United States, we face the same skepticism from our colleagues where we said maybe there is something else. Mainly because, again, the feeling was this was all psychological, was a placebo effect, and so on and so forth. But now nobody disputes that beside an autoimmune response to gluten that characterizes celiac disease, and also an allergic response to gluten that characterized with allergy, there is a third form of an immune response to gluten that is not allergic, not autoimmune, yet create the same kind of collateral damage, inflammation, without destroyed the intestine that we call gluten sensitivity or non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Like people with celiac disease, this individual will benefit going on a gluten-free diet even if they fail to be diagnosed as celiacs.
Dr. Fasano, let's just dial back a second, talk about diagnosis, because when we spoke with you many years ago, we were just hearing about a blood test. Until then, the only way to do this kind of diagnostic workup was to do what's called endoscopy, in which a gastroenterologist would actually go into the small intestine with a tube and snip out a piece of the small intestine and look at it under a microscope. How have things evolved over the last decade or two, and how good are our diagnostic tests, including those endoscopy studies? We've heard that if you don't look in the right place, you might miss it.
So, Joy, indeed, it's quite interesting when we have the last chat in 1999, the target of the immune response to gluten in celiac disease was just discovered. It was called tissue transglutaminase. And we were the first group to clone the human tissue transglutaminase, or TTG, and generate a test, a blood test, to diagnose people with celiac disease. At that time, the guidelines to diagnose somebody was very long, cumbersome, implied not one but 3 endoscopies with 3 stages and very painful, lengthy protocol. Since the discovery of this TTG and the development that ELISA test, this blood test, the landscape is completely changed. Matter of fact, this test is one of the most powerful in terms of diagnosing people with diseases that affect humankind, because it's extremely sensitive. I pick it up all celiacs, and specific. It's positive only in celiacs and nobody else. However, because this is a condition for life, as we were saying before, because this is an autoimmune disease, you don't want a strong indication. You want certainty. And the certainty can be obtained only if the screening test is followed by an endoscopy with an intestinal biopsy. But you also mentioned correctly, Joe, that unfortunately the gold standard, quote-unquote, endoscopy also has its caveats. You do the biopsy in the wrong place, you do not manage the biopsy correctly, you don't cut and orient this well, then you will have a problem. So it need to be done, correctly. But the combination, the blood test and the endoscopy with the biopsy really gives us a powerful tool to give certainty to the individual that he or she is affected by celiac disease.
Now, of course, what you've just mentioned is that there are people who seem to basically have a gluten sensitivity, even though the blood test comes back negative. And were they to go forward to the next step and have endoscopy, that too would be negative. But they insist, oftentimes to their health professionals' dismay, that if they stop exposure to gluten, they feel dramatically better. And so a lot of your colleagues have basically said, well, celiac disease, or more specifically this gluten sensitivity, is the disease du jour. Patients are attributing all of their health problems to this condition. It's all in their heads.
So, Joe, two considerations here. One, this is a déjà vu. The skepticism and, criticisms were raised against celiac disease 20 years ago when we start to move the first steps of what this was, how frequent it was, what kind of symptoms you can have, how do you diagnose it, and so on and so forth. We see just exactly the same with the landscape of gluten sensitivity. A lot of skepticism and preconcept that, again, slow down in general, science knowledge and advance of, clinical care. If you are a good doctor, your final goal is to improve the quality of life for your patients, no matter what. And if these people, they really claim that their life has been changed for the better in sometimes dramatically fashion, you need to respect what is their sense and try to understand and interrogate yourself, because they are not dogma in medicine. The rule of today is the junk of tomorrow. And if you are really entrenched in a rigid algorithm, history will tell you that sooner or later you will be proved to be wrong. So you have to have the humility to say, you know what, think change. Stuff is dynamic. Is that true that there is a condition that other than celiac disease can give you probable gluten? Absolutely. I don't think anybody will dispute that. It's also true there is a fat component, because this is now, again, the fashionable diet of du jour. No question about that. But in my opinion, vilifying this diet as a fad by generalizing the concept, it's a major mistake, because for celiac disease, the gluten-free diet is like insulin for diabetics. And also for people with gluten sensitivity, these are people that sometimes have a tremendously negative impact on quality of life, because these people, they may have problem in walking. Some people, they come on wheelchair in our clinic. Some people, they have tremendous impact in their behavior, all the way to schizophrenia and autism and whatever. And they have a 360 degrees turnaround of their lives when they embrace the gluten-free diet. Call it whatever. The clinical outcome is so remarkable better that they don't care. If this is a placebo effect, if it's true, the only thing that they care that they do a much better job by being gluten-free.
Dr. Fasano, when we have previously done shows on celiac disease and discussed the benefits, the absolute critical necessity of a gluten-free diet for a person who has celiac disease, we have heard later from some listeners who've said, Oh, well, all those symptoms sounded like things I was dealing with, so I tried a gluten-free diet and I feel so much better. I'll never go back on gluten again. These are people who have not been diagnosed with celiac disease. Now, I actually have no problem with people controlling their own diet, but we have been told if you want to get a diagnosis, if you actually want to know whether or not you really do have celiac disease, going on a gluten-free diet first is a mistake. Explain that, please.
Absolutely. While it is true that no matter where I am on the spectrum of gluten-related disorders, i.e. celiac disease, gluten sensitivity, with allergy, the intervention is to go on a gluten-free diet. The way that you engage it, for how long, and the consequence of failing a strict gluten-free diet are very, very different depending where you are on the spectrum. And this is an interesting phenomenon because the fact that there is not an quote-unquote aura of the drug, but there's just a diet, empower people to take ownership and do intervention by themselves without having the advice of a healthcare professional. I think that, this is one of the few conditions in which some people, they go for the treatment before the diagnosis. That it will be a nonsense in any other condition that can affect humankind. Think about any other autoimmune diseases. Who will go with insulin injection without being diagnosed with diabetes? Who will go on immunosuppressant without being diagnosed for sure with rheumatoid arthritis, MS? Nobody would do it. But here, people, particularly and partially justified by the frustration to have symptoms for so long without having an answer what's wrong with them, start to go on this global village of communication that is the internet and say, aha, look at this is me. And I said, what is this? Celiac disease, what is the solution? The gluten-free diet, I'm going to give it a try because I don't trust the medical establishment anymore. And then, once everything goes better, you read the fine, disclaimer that say, by the way, it's for life. By the way, you have to scrutinize everything that you eat. And then, start to realize and say, well, if I want to commit for this, I need to know for sure if I have celiac disease or not. But once you're going gluten-free, the tools that will allow us to establish in which part of the spectrum you are gone. So that's the reason why it's definitely a mistake. If an advice I should give to the listener is, if you really do believe that something's wrong with you and gluten because you do not agree, before to do anything, seek the advice of a knowledgeable healthcare professional.
Now, you said something very controversial, Dr. Fasano, a little while ago. You said this is a growing global epidemic. Really? And if so, why? Why does it seem more common these days?
Well, it is controversial, but it's factual. I mean, studies done by our group and many others really seems to point at the fact that we are on an increase of the prevalence of celiac disease over time. We've done a study, following 3,000 healthy adults for more than 50 years, and we realized that the celiac disease, prevalence increased, doubled. Every 15 years. Was 1 in 500 in the mid-70s, was 1 in 250 in the late 80s, and now it's roughly 1%. And this is really something that really bothers us, scientifically speaking, because for celiac disease, contrary to many other autoimmune diseases, we know the culprit. And therefore, the paradigm was, okay, you're born with the genes, then you eat gluten that comes into your diet undisputably within the first year of life. That's when you set the stage for the autoimmune process. Now, some people, they become clinically apparent right away. These are the pediatric cases. Other people, they have the onset of symptoms as adults. And the interpretation was always, well, it all depends how aggressive is the immune system. A very aggressive immune system will create the critical mass of intestinal damage that puts you clinically over the edge rather soon, and therefore you develop celiac disease as a child. If you have a slow-paced immune system, it will take longer, you develop as an adult. That was the premises. But when we did this study, that again, it's been corroborated by many others, we realized there are people that can eat gluten, the undisputable trigger of autoimmune process in celiac disease, for 20, 30, There were two ladies for 70 years without being sick whatsoever. And then all of a sudden something happened to them. And they switched from tolerance, i.e. stay healthy, to the immune response, i.e. the state of disease that leads to celiac disease. So the question is, what's going on? And the time is so short that the only explanation is that we are changing our environment too fast for us to genetically adapt to these changes. And again, we see this in asthma, we see this in diabetes, we see this in multiple sclerosis, we see this with autism, and I can go on and on and on.
Dr. Fasano, we've been talking about the dangers of gluten. Could you give us a brief description? What the heck is gluten?
Gluten is a one-of-a-kind protein. Foodstuffs have three major components: sugars, proteins, and complex fats. In order to make use of these nutrients, we have to pretty much dismantle them in the forming blocks. So for complex sugars, we have to go down to the simple sugar. For triglycerides, i.e. fat, we have to go to monoglycerides. And for proteins, we have to dismantle them in the forming blocks. They are called amino acids. To do that, we have scissors, i.e. enzymes that do this job. Particularly for proteins, they are the ones that we care the most, because those are the ones that can instigate an immune response that leads to autoimmunity. The job that we do is like, if you compare a protein to a sort of pearl necklace, you have to break this necklace, cut this in pieces that we call peptides, and then peel off this pearl that are the amino acids one at a time. Gluten is a one-of-a-kind protein because we cannot do that. It's one of the few proteins, if not the only protein, that we cannot completely digest. The reason why, because we didn't evolve to eat gluten. Our species evolved for almost 2.5 million years has been gluten-free for 99.99%. Gluten came into the picture only in the last seconds of evolution 10,000 years ago, where our ancestors changed dramatically lifestyle and agriculture was born. And then they start to play with grains until they create grains containing gluten. The best that we can do is to cut in pieces, i.e. peptides. And therefore, because the peptides, i.e. proteins, can induce immune system reactions that can lead to autoimmunity if you are genetically predisposed, the risk with gluten is much higher than any other protein because, these peptides, they can sit for hours into the guts. And if they find a way to sneak through this intestinal barrier and been seen by an immune system that is, again, genetically skewed to develop an immune response like celiac disease, then you're in trouble.
You're listening to Dr. Alessio Fasano, founder and director of the Center for Celiac Research at Massachusetts General Hospital for Children. His book is Gluten Freedom.
Coming up, we'll find out more about the symptoms of celiac disease and Dr. Fasano's gluten-free diet.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. If you value the health information you get when you listen to The People's Pharmacy, consider subscribing to our email newsletter. You'll get the latest health news and information on upcoming podcasts delivered to your inbox twice a week. Look for the link at peoplespharmacy.com.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Squatty Potty Toilet Step Stools, creating healthy toilet posture for fast, easy elimination. More information about how toilet posture affects your health at squattypotty.com.
And by Redix Industries, makers of utterly smooth foot cream with shea butter, helping dry, cracked feet feel soft and smooth. 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
If you'd like to order a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 964. That number again, 800-732-2334. Or place the order online at peoplespharmacy.com.
We're talking about gluten and the difficulties it can cause in sensitive individuals. who are more common than you might imagine. What should people be eating, and what should they avoid?
Our guest is Dr. Alessio Fasano, Director of the Center for Celiac Research and Division Chief of the Department of Pediatric Gastroenterology and Nutrition at Massachusetts General Hospital for Children. He's also a visiting professor at Harvard Medical School. His book is Gluten Freedom.
Dr. Fasano, would you please go back and tell our listeners what are the symptoms of celiac disease, and do they differ at all from gluten sensitivity?
Well, classically, we divided these symptoms in intestinal and extraintestinal. And, the intestinal symptoms, they can be bloating, gas, abdominal pain, irregular bowel movements. It can go from diarrhea to constipation, vomiting, nausea. We perceive this as the most frequent, symptoms that people with celiac disease can experience, and intuitively so, because the damage occurs in the intestine. However, over time, and that was one reason why we overlooked celiac disease for so long in the United States, particularly when the critical mass of damage is limited, so that, the damage really involved only a small part of the intestine, so the rest can subsidize. You will not have GI symptoms, Mark. You can have other symptoms. You can have, anemia, with that chronic fatigue. You can have the skin manifestation we were discussing before, the dermatitis herpetiformis. You can have joint pain. You can have infertility. You can have peripheral neuropathy. You can have teeth discoloration and lesions. You can have osteoporosis. You can have miscarriages. There are a lot of very interesting neurological, psychiatric conditions related to celiac disease, because there is this crosstalk between the gut and the brain that happen all the time. So it's really difficult to diagnose celiac disease if you don't know exactly what you're talking about, because it's truly a clinical chameleon. And that's one other reason why we overlooked celiac disease for many years in the United States. The classical symptoms with this chronic diarrhea, weight loss, failure to thrive has not been the way the disease presents itself. The most frequent way that the disease presents itself now worldwide, not only here, is anemia, and with that chronic fatigue. Now, gluten sensitivity has very much similar clinical presentation. Therefore, the two conditions cannot be distinguished on a clinical ground, unfortunately.
Now, we've heard for a very long time that a lot of the symptoms, like osteoporosis in particular, might be a result of lack of nutrient absorption because of the autoimmune disease and because of the destruction of those little cells in the lining of the small intestine, that people just wouldn't get enough calcium, perhaps not enough magnesium. But it sounds like it's a little more complicated than that, especially when it comes to the neurological symptoms. And we've even heard that perhaps Alzheimer's disease is more common among celiac victims. Tell us a little bit about the underlying mechanism. Is it more than just absorption of nutrients?
Yes. The most obvious explanation, the ones that we really put on the table at the beginning, was indeed the lack of nutrients that can create the problem. Let's talk about osteoporosis. The bones, they are built in a very dynamic fashion. Even if they stay the same length when you're an adult, you continue in a steady state, kind of change and reshape them all the time. And this is due to the work of two different cells. The one that chopped up and destroyed the bones, they are called osteoclasts. And then the ones that build up the bones, they are called osteoblasts. The osteoblasts, they need material to build, mainly calcium and vitamin D. If you don't provide them material, then they cannot build the bones, while the ones that keep destroying the bones, they're still working, and that leads to osteoporosis. So that was the explanation. But then we realized that beside that, there's also a bona fide attack of the bones by the immune system that, again, will destroy some of the critical, component of the bones as we destroy critical component of the intestine when they are under attack. The same applies to the brain. Very fascinating. We know very little. But, people that start to really realize that, once these immune cells leave the intestine, they can create the collateral damage, i.e. inflammation everywhere, including the brains, what we call neuroinflammation.
So, Dr. Fasano, it sounds like there's a lot we don't completely know about this condition, and the only solution till now is the diet. So tell us a little bit about the gluten-free diet, and in particular, the Fasano diet.
Okay. Well, the fact that we know, and it's unique, that the environmental trigger of autoimmunity for celiac disease gives us a luxury that we don't have with any other autoimmune disease, i.e. to treat, not cure, treat the autoimmune process by subtracting from the equation one of the two key elements. Of course, you can't touch the genes because we don't know them all. And also, if they are there, they must be important for other functions. But the environmental trigger is the one that eventually is needed for the immune system to create this damage. When you subtract the instigator, the immune system that works in economy has no business to continue to fight because there is no enemy, and will shut down. Will remember forever, but will not continue to create that inflammation. That's the heart and soul of what is the importance of the gluten-free diet, and the reason why it needs to be done for life and 100%, not 99%, because even the crumb can instigate the same immune response that a loaf of bread will create, because the immune system goes all in. Now, when we go gluten-free diet and we talk about efficacy, like in any other, therapeutic intervention, you have exceptions. So some people that do not respond. We know that 10% of people that go gluten-free will not respond. I will continue to have symptoms despite they adhere strictly to a gluten-free diet. I have also to clarify the concept. When we say gluten-free, it doesn't mean zero gluten because, of course, the cross-contamination, minimal amount of gluten is something that routinely is out there. And we know there is a threshold that is safe for the vast majority of people with celiac disease, that is this 20 parts per million. So any amount of below that is not seen by the immune system by the vast majority of people with celiac disease. But this 10%, for reason we don't know, they have an immune system that is super sensitive, even to minuscule amount. And for those, the solution that we were able to eventually generate was to create this very, very strict diet. I hate that they call Fasano diet because it's a nasty diet. But it's a diet in which for 3 months this individual cannot eat other than naturally gluten-free products, so no substitutes. They can eat fresh fruit, fresh vegetable, fresh meat, fish, olive oil, and as grain only rice and nothing else. Given the break of the immune system, most of the time, they were able to, have the inflammation gone, and when they are reintroduced to a more canonical, typical gluten-free diet, they're able to handle it that way.
So that Fasano diet, which you object to its name, is a temporary measure. It's not a lifetime measure. But a gluten-free diet is for life.
Absolutely, Terry. The Fasano diet is meant just to give a break for a short period of time until, the immune system readjusts itself and got used to manage this minuscule amount of gluten. The gluten-free diet is for life, at least right now, because we don't have currently any alternative to the gluten-free diet, even if there are some in the pipeline.
Dr. Fasano, you've mentioned rice. We know that rice does not have gluten in it. Wheat, barley, and rye all have gluten. What about oats? It seems to be pretty controversial in the celiac community.
Yeah, oats were among the grains that were forbidden for celiac sufferers until the recent past when, our agronomists start to look into the composition of oats that taught us that actually they do not have those proteins that can instigate an immune response and provided the rationale to consider, reintroducing oats in people with celiac disease. There are a couple caveats there. One, that oats are, manipulated the same meals with the other gluten-containing grains. So the cross-contamination is the rule. So regular oats is something that you cannot definitely use as a celiac. But if they are managed in a specific dedicated, facilities, when given with people with celiac disease, the vast majority of people, they tolerate oats. I say not the totality, but the vast majority, because it seems that still a small percentage, between 5 and 7% of people with celiac disease, they do not tolerate oats. So the way that we manage this, a newly diagnosed celiac goes on a gluten-free diet, including oats-free. When his or her symptoms are gone, the blood test is back to normal, the endoscopy shows healing of the damage, then and only then we recommend them to introduce oats in their diet. If they are among the 90% lucky ones, they will be fine and they continue to eat oats. If they are in the unlucky 5% group, then they have to eliminate oats as well.
Dr. Fasano, in case our listeners haven't noticed, you have a bit of an accent. And I'm guessing that maybe your homeland is fond of, shall we say, gluten-containing foods, perhaps pasta and pizza. And so I'm just wondering, how popular are you back home? And how do you deal with teenagers? Because teenagers love pizza and pasta and, even birthday cake on special occasions.
Strange, I don't hear any accent at all. But, of course, my homeland, Italy, traditionally is pictured as the high consumer of gluten-containing, foodstuff like pizza, pasta, and cookies, and so on and so forth. But interestingly enough, I'm not saying that I'm popular, but I'm definitely known, and not for the wrong reason, because celiac disease has a long tradition in Italy. Gluten-free products are widely available. A lot of time people, our patients, that they are planning vacations in Italy, they are worried, said, how am I going to survive there? And they come back pleasantly surprised how easy is life there, because there is a great level of awareness and therefore availability of gluten-free products. Now, the key elements in embracing the diet and live happily with that is indeed to take ownership. Also tough are newly diagnosed teenagers. Remember, this is the age in which you want to blend with your group, and anything that you do different will create problems. And therefore, this is one of the most challenging, situation that we face in our clinical routine.
How do you help the teenager who has just been diagnosed with celiac disease?
Well, my approach is, rather than patronize and, give them, the lesson, I make a teenager myself. And I start to think, beside the kind of language that I have to use, putting myself in their shoes, what would be my feeling? First of all, I would be really upset. I would be in denial. And if I finally come to the conclusion that I'm affected something that, will not go away, I don't want to deal with this. Particularly if the symptoms are not that bad. I don't care about the evolution. If I can really, develop comorbidities, can be serious. I just want to just ignore it. I don't want to deal with this. So in this situation, I'm very factual. I said, you know what? You have been diagnosed with this, will not go away. I know that you're upset. I know that you don't want to deal with this, and I totally respect that. Guess what? I had really a great, great skill that was given to me. I can take this away, but I have to give you something else of the same magnitude as another autoimmune disease. So give me celiac disease, I give you inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn's, or type 1 diabetes, or multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, something like that, because, you got to have it, because we can do anything about this. And they start to see light. They start to realize that after all, it's a diet, it's painful, it's socially awkward, very difficult to implement, but after all, there are no side effects, no hairs falling down, and no acne coming up, and so on and so forth. Most of them, they come around. Some of them are much more resilient, and the only thing that you can do is to be supportive, say, fine, I give you the factual information, You are old enough to decide. I'm here for you. If you change your mind, come back and we're going to rediscuss.
Dr. Fasano, do you ever imagine a day when there might be a drug or some other treatment besides the gluten-free diet?
I think so. I think that it's already in the pipeline, the development of drugs that can be used in association with a gluten-free diet so that you will be safe in case that you are in a situation you don't control. When you're in your household, you know what you're doing. But when you travel, when you go to dinner with friends, you go on vacation, you're at the mercy of people that have to appreciate how stringent has to be your diet. These drugs are already in the pipeline. Some of them are the very last step of the drug evolution, the phase 3 trial. So I definitely see these drugs coming into the pipeline in the near future.
Dr. Alessio Fasano, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
It's been my pleasure to be back on your show. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Dr. Alessio Fasano. He's director of the Center for Celiac Research and division chief of the Department of Pediatric Gastroenterology and Nutrition at Massachusetts General Hospital for Children. He's also a visiting professor at Harvard Medical School. He's the author of Gluten Freedom, a research-based book that separates fact from fiction about how gluten affects health.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wadarski engineers the program. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
The People's Pharmacy is made possible by Redix Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Extra Care 20 Cream with 20% urea for extra skin protection. The number's 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
If you'd like to order a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 964. That number again is 800-732-2334, or you can find it online at peoplespharmacy.com.
And when you visit the website, check out prescription drugs, herbal medicines, and home remedies. You can share your own experience and thoughts on today's show. Look for our listen and read offer of Dr. Fasano's book together with the CD of today's show.
Why not sign up for our free online newsletter or the free podcast of the show? You'll never miss another People's Pharmacy program again. You can also share it with a friend. It's all there at peoplespharmacy.com.
In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to The People's Pharmacy.
Beautiful Anonymous changes each week. It defies genres and expectations. For example, our most recent episode, I talked to a woman who survived a murder attempt by her own son. But just the week before that, we just talked the whole time about Star Trek. We've had other recent episodes about sexting in languages that are not your first language, or what it's like to get weight loss surgery. It's unpredictable, it's real, it's honest, it's raw. Get Beautiful Anonymous wherever you listen to podcasts.